There's a photograph from 1853, yellowed and cracked at the edges, sitting in a Parisian archive where almost nobody bothers to look anymore. It shows the Pont Neuf, supposedly one of the oldest bridges still standing over the Seine, completed in 1607 under the reign of Henry IV. It's a triumph of French engineering, or so every textbook will tell you. But stare at that photograph long enough, really stare at it, and something starts to feel wrong. The bridge looks like it's sinking. The place where stone meets riverbank doesn't line up with the surrounding streets. Architectural details that should be visible at eye level are underground, swallowed by earth that shouldn't be there. The original street level, clearly marked by cornices and carved features designed to be seen by pedestrians, now sits buried beneath meters of soil. The bridge doesn't match its own city. It's sitting in a hole. And the entire surrounding landscape had to be built upward just to meet it. Historians have a tidy explanation for this. Cities, they say, naturally accumulate layers over centuries. Garbage piles up. Streets get repaved. Construction debris settles. It sounds perfectly reasonable until you start measuring, because we're not talking about a thin dusting of time here. We're talking about 3 meters, 4 meters, in some places, more than 10 meters of accumulated material burying the original foundations of structures that were supposedly built right where they stand. That's not a slow gathering of dust and broken pottery over 500 years. That's something else entirely. And the Pont Neuf isn't alone. Pull up archival photographs from London, and you'll find the same thing. Check Prague, check Moscow, and St. Petersburg. Cross the Atlantic to New York, Boston, Philadelphia, and Chicago. Everywhere, on every continent where these old stone bridges survive, the same anomaly repeats itself with eerie consistency. Massive arches disappearing into the ground. Lower levels completely filled with compacted earth. Foundations sitting far deeper than any architect would have designed them to sit. The pattern is unsettling precisely because of how universal it is. If this were happening in one city, you could chalk it up to local flooding or some regional quirk of geology, but it's dozens of cities spread across thousands of miles, on opposite sides of oceans, in completely different climates. And yet the burial depth is strangely similar. The type of sediment is strangely similar. The way the bridges relate to their surrounding streets awkwardly, as though the streets were an afterthought built to accommodate something much older, is strangely similar. Coincidence starts to feel like a very inadequate word. So what's the official story? Urban accumulation? Centuries of human activity gradually raising the ground. Streets periodically elevated to improve drainage. Buildings demolished and rebuilt on older foundations. Fire debris adding layers. Each generation building a little higher than the last. And over time, the oldest structures simply ending up below grade. It's a neat narrative. And it holds together right up until you do the arithmetic. Consider what it actually takes to raise an entire city by 3 to 5 meters. That volume of material would require deliberate, large-scale earth moving on a staggering level, thousands upon thousands of cartloads of filled dirt, hauled in and spread across every street, every alley, every courtyard, and it would need to happen relatively quickly, because you can't raise one block by 4 meters and leave the neighboring block at its original level. The drainage problems alone would make the city uninhabitable within a season. Defenders of the conventional timeline will point out that cities like Chicago actually did raise their street levels deliberately in the mid-1800s, jacking up entire buildings and filling in beneath them. That's true and well documented. But here's what doesn't get discussed enough. Why did they need to? The official reason was sewage and drainage. The city was too low, too prone to flooding, but too low compared to what? If it was built at ground level by the people who supposedly founded it, why was it suddenly too low just decades later? Something had changed. The ground had risen, or the infrastructure had sunk, or both. The relationship between the built environment and the surrounding landscape had shifted dramatically in a very short window. And that's the question that keeps nagging. Not whether the ground level changed, it obviously did. And mainstream historians acknowledge that much. The real question is how fast. Gradual accumulation over centuries leaves mixed layers, a little ash here, some pottery shards there, a stratum of rubble, then organic material. It's messy, varied, inconsistent. But what researchers report finding beneath many of these bridges is something different. Thick, relatively uniform layers of fine sediment, almost clay-like, deposited in what appears to be a single event or a very compressed series of events. The kind of deposit you'd expect from a massive flood carrying suspended particulate matter, not from generations of people slowly raising their streets. The bridges themselves were clearly not designed for the world they currently inhabit. When renovation crews have dug down to expose buried sections, the full proportions suddenly make sense. Lower arches, meant to be at ground level, providing covered passage for pedestrians and carts, now sit entombed in packed earth. Upper roadways, designed as the topmost level of a sophisticated, multi-tiered structure, now function as the only level, looking oddly squat compared to the grandeur hiding beneath. What we see today is the top slice of something much more ambitious, with its lower stories hidden like a secret nobody was meant to find. Photographs from the mid to late 1800s capture workers actively excavating around these foundations, digging to expose stonework that had been completely concealed. Contemporary engineering reports describe the confusion of professionals who couldn't reconcile what they were uncovering with what they'd been told. They found chambers, passageways, drainage systems of a complexity that made no sense for a structure built at current street level. In some documented cases, entire rooms sealed within bridge supports, preserved like time capsules, untouched since whatever buried them had done its work. And yet, in nearly every case, the official record absorbed these discoveries without changing the accepted narrative. The rooms were noted, catalogued, and quietly forgotten. The excavations were completed, the holes filled back in, and the bridges returned to their diminished modern role, as if nothing remarkable had happened at all. Something buried these bridges. Something raised the ground beneath entire cities across the world, within a startlingly narrow window of history. The conventional explanation says it was us, just people, doing people things, slowly and unremarkably over centuries. But the physical evidence tells a more complicated and far more unsettling story. And it starts with a question nobody in an official capacity seems eager to answer. If these bridges were built at their current depth on purpose, why does every single architectural detail suggest they were meant to be seen from a street level that no longer exists? Now, forget the dirt for a moment. Forget the burial depths and the sediment layers. Set all of that aside and just look at the stones themselves, because the stones have their own story to tell. And it doesn't fit the timeline we've been given. Pick any of these old bridges. Run your hand along the granite blocks that form the arches. If you could get close enough, what you'd feel is a surface so smooth it almost seems polished, with joints so tight you couldn't slide a razor blade between them. These aren't rough-hewn field stones stacked by village masons. These are precision-cut blocks, some weighing dozens of tons. Fitted together with tolerances measured in millimeters, the arches they form are mathematically perfect, not approximately right, not close enough for the period, but geometrically exact. They distribute load through engineering principles that weren't supposed to be formally understood for another century or more after these bridges were allegedly built. And that contradiction sits at the heart of something nobody has adequately explained. Think about what it actually takes to achieve that kind of precision with stone. In the 1600s and 1700s, the tools available were supposedly chisels, hammers, hand-operated cranes, and a lot of human muscle. No computer modeling, no standardized mathematical notation for structural calculations, no industrial machinery for cutting or transporting massive blocks across long distances. And yet here they are, 100-ton granite pieces, quarried from sites sometimes hundreds of miles away, shaped with machine-like accuracy, transported by methods nobody has convincingly demonstrated, and placed with a level of exactness that modern contractors would find challenging even with diamond-tipped saws and laser-guided positioning. The official explanation waves this away with vague references to master craftsmen and generations of accumulated knowledge. But that's an appeal to mystery dressed up as an answer. It doesn't explain how. It just insists that it happened. The mortar between those stones raises its own uncomfortable questions. When chemical analyses have been performed on samples from these ancient bridges, and such analyses are rare, which is itself suspicious, the results don't always match what you'd expect from period-appropriate recipes. Some samples contain the compositions suggest a more advanced understanding of chemistry than the official timeline permits. Similarly, iron clamps and metal supports found within some structures show metallurgical signatures, specific carbon ratios, evidence of particular smelting temperatures that point to manufacturing processes more sophisticated than what medieval or early modern forges were supposed to produce. Taken individually, each anomaly can be explained away. Maybe the mortar recipe was a lucky accident. Maybe the iron came from a particularly talented blacksmith. But taken together, they paint a picture of builders who knew more than they should have, working with materials that shouldn't have existed yet, achieving results that still impress structural engineers today. And then there's the architectural clash. Walk up to one of these bridges and look at the buildings lining the streets on either side. In most cases, the bridge and its surroundings don't speak the same design language. The bridge feels older, grander, built according to a different aesthetic vocabulary. The surrounding structures adapted to the bridge, built to accommodate its presence, rather than the other way around. It's as if the bridge was already standing when the current city grew up around it. Some researchers have pointed out that this pattern, a monumental structure that predates and visually dominates its later neighbors, is exactly what you'd expect if these bridges were inherited rather than built by the civilizations that claim credit for them. The cities arrived second. The bridges were already there. This becomes even more striking when you compare bridges across continents. Buried bridges in Paris share structural details with buried bridges in Boston, arches in Prague, mirror arches in Philadelphia. The proportions are consistent. The decorative stonework uses similar motifs. The engineering principles are identical. Some researchers argue these structures share specific construction signatures difficult to explain through independent invention. Either there was a network of global trade and architectural exchange operating far earlier than conventional history allows, with techniques crossing oceans that supposedly couldn't be navigated, or these structures share a common origin, a single building tradition spread across the world, producing bridges of uniform quality on multiple continents simultaneously. Some theorists have attached a name to this hypothetical source, Tartaria, a vast empire supposedly erased from the historical record after its destruction. Whether that specific label holds up to scrutiny is debatable, and serious researchers on both sides would caution against treating any single theory as settled fact. But the physical evidence that something doesn't add up, that's harder to dismiss. The bridges exist. Their buried foundations exist. Their anomalous engineering exists. Those aren't theories, they're measurements, photographs, and chemical analyses. The interpretation is where the debate lives, and it's a debate that mainstream institutions have been remarkably reluctant to engage with seriously. Here's the logical problem that ties this section together, and it's one defenders of the conventional narrative have never satisfactorily addressed. If these bridges were truly built in the 1600s and 1700s at their current buried depth, meaning below what was then ground level, the builders would have had to excavate enormous pits, construct foundations and lower arches underground where nobody could use them, and then deliberately fill everything back in with dirt. The labor would have been absurd. Thousands of workers, years of effort, vast quantities of stone and mortar invested in architecture that would be immediately hidden. No engineer in any century would design a project that way. No government would fund it. No workforce would carry it out without someone recording how senseless the whole enterprise was. But flip the assumption. Imagine these bridges were built at ground level, fully exposed, fully functional. Their multiple tiers serving different transportation purposes in a sophisticated urban system we can barely reconstruct. Imagine something happened afterward, something catastrophic and rapid, that buried them under meters of sediment. Suddenly, the proportions make sense. The hidden arches make sense. The sealed chambers and forgotten passageways make sense. The only thing that stops making sense is the timeline we've been handed. And when the physical evidence contradicts the official story, one of them has to be wrong. The stones don't lie. They can't. They just sit there in the dark, underground, waiting for someone to measure them carefully enough to notice that nothing about their presence adds up. Let's get specific. Because generalities are easy to dismiss, but details are stubborn things. Start with the Charles Bridge in Prague, one of the most photographed structures in Europe. The official history is confident and precise. Construction began in 1357 under King Charles IV, designed by architect Peter Parler, completed in the early 1400s. Every guidebook repeats this, but photographs from the late 1800s tell a version the guidebooks leave out. When maintenance crews went to work on the bridge piers, those massive stone supports in the Vltava River, they expected foundations a few meters below the waterline. What they found sent them back with questions nobody could answer. The piers didn't end where anyone thought. They kept going down, much farther than blueprints suggested. What engineers assumed were the foundations turned out to be the middle sections of much taller structures. The actual bases were buried under meters of riverbed sediment, the same dense, uniform sediment found beneath streets on both banks. The bridge was significantly larger than anyone alive had realized. Its true scale had been hidden underground for centuries, and the discovery was met not with academic curiosity but with a quiet maintenance note that almost nobody ever read. Cross half a continent to St. Petersburg, Russia. Here's a city with one of the most dramatic founding myths in European history. Peter the Great, we're told, built it from nothing, starting in 1703, carved a capital out of frozen swampland through sheer imperial will and thousands of dead laborers. Compelling story. But the bridges of St. Petersburg don't cooperate with that narrative. They're too sophisticated for a city supposedly only 300 years old. The stonework matches techniques found on bridges across Western Europe, structures allegedly centuries older. And just like everywhere else, the lower levels are buried. Street level sits conspicuously higher than original architectural features were designed for. Some researchers have floated an alternative reading. Perhaps Peter didn't build a new capital. Perhaps he arrived at the ruins of something already there, partially buried and partially intact, and claimed it, rebuilt on top, gave it a new name and origin story. Mainstream historians reject this outright, but the stones beneath the streets remain stubbornly indifferent to official rejection. Cross the Atlantic to Boston in the 1880s. Workers repairing an older stone bridge made a discovery that baffled the overseeing engineers. Beneath the visible arch, the one everyone assumed was the entire bridge, they found a second complete level. And beneath that, a third, 3 fully constructed tiers, stacked vertically, with the lower 2 completely buried. Newspaper accounts describe genuine confusion. Why build 3 complete arch levels when one would suffice? The materials alone would have been enormously expensive. It made no structural sense unless you reconsidered the premise. What if those levels weren't redundant? What if each served a different function in a vertically integrated system that no longer exists? Water transport at the lowest tier, pedestrian traffic in the middle, heavy vehicles at the top, a city designed in 3 dimensions. With infrastructure layered the way, modern parking garages stack cars except built in stone, built to last millennia, by someone whose ambitions went far beyond anything those 1880s workers could imagine. The engineers noted their findings, completed repairs, and filled the holes back in. The lower levels went dark again. Perhaps the most haunting discovery comes from London, an 1823 report, dry, bureaucratic. The kind that gets filed and forgotten in municipal archives describes a sewer crew encountering something extraordinary 6 meters below street level. Massive stone arches, perfectly intact, spanning what had clearly once been a flowing river, but was now solid ground. An entire bridge, completely underground, with no part visible from the surface. The river it crossed had been buried too, filled in, sealed off, erased from the city's geography. The report noted the bridge showed no signs of intentional demolition. Stones undamaged, mortar solid. It looked as though water had simply stopped flowing one day and mud had taken its place. A river frozen not in ice, but in earth, with a perfectly functional bridge still arching across it in permanent darkness. What kind of event does that? Rivers are dynamic systems. They flow, erode, cut deeper channels. They resist being filled. The only way to entomb a river and its bridge simultaneously is with a catastrophic volume of material arriving faster than the water can carry it away. The bridges aren't the only evidence hiding underground. Walk through old districts of almost any European city and pay attention to the oldest buildings. Many ground floors aren't ground floors anymore, they're basements. Windows sit at ankle level. Original front doors open onto descending staircases. Cathedrals sit in visible depressions, surrounded by modern streets built up around them. Shops that once welcomed customers at street level now have original entrances 3 meters underground, accessible through modern doors, cut into what used to be second-story windows. Newspaper accounts from the 1800s describe crews digging foundations and stumbling upon fully furnished rooms several meters below the surface. Dishes on tables, clothes in wardrobes, tools resting where they'd been set down. People had left quickly, expecting to return. These discoveries were apparently common enough to be considered unremarkable, meriting barely a paragraph in local papers, and yet somehow they vanished from popular awareness. An entire buried stratum of civilization exists beneath streets across Europe and America, documented in scattered archives, visible in the architecture, if you know where to look, and almost completely absent from the history we're taught. The bridges are the most dramatic examples because they're the hardest to hide. Too big, too structurally important, too embedded in the cities that depend on them. You can bury a shop, you can fill in a basement and forget it existed. But a bridge crosses a river. It connects neighborhoods. It carries traffic. It can't just disappear. And so they remain half-buried witnesses to a ground level that once existed and a world somehow swallowed beneath our feet. The question isn't whether these things are real. The excavation reports, photographs, and architectural evidence are documented. The question is, what happened? And nobody with the authority to investigate seems particularly interested in finding out. So if something buried an entire civilization's infrastructure, bridges, streets, ground floors, even rivers, the obvious next question is what? And when? The when part might actually be easier to narrow down than you'd expect, because the early 19th century left behind a trail of clues that are hard to ignore once you line them up. Start with 1816, a year so brutal it earned its own nickname. The year without a summer. Frost hit in July. Snow fell in August across the northern hemisphere. Crops failed catastrophically from New England to Western Europe. Livestock starved. Families starved. Food riots broke out in cities that had never seen them before. The official explanation points to Mount Tambora in Indonesia, which erupted violently in 1815, one of the largest volcanic events in recorded history, throwing enough ash and sulfur into the upper atmosphere to dim sunlight across the globe, and that explanation is well supported by geological evidence. But some researchers have asked a different kind of question. What if Tambora wasn't the cause of the chaos, but a symptom of something larger? What if the eruption was one piece of a much bigger geological upheaval that hasn't been fully accounted for? The volcanic record from this period is genuinely unusual. And that's not a fringe observation, it's in the data. Between 1800 and 1850, the planet experienced a pronounced spike in volcanic activity. Tambora gets the headlines, but it wasn't alone. Major eruptions occurred in Japan, Iceland, the Philippines, and South America within a relatively compressed time frame. Earthquakes rattled regions that had been stable for generations. Tsunamis struck coastlines with little warning. The geological chaos of this half-century is well documented in scientific literature, though it's rarely discussed as a connected pattern. Each event gets its own chapter, its own isolated explanation. Tambora was a subduction zone release. Iceland's volcanoes were rifting events. The earthquakes were unrelated tectonic adjustments, taken one at a time. Sure, each explanation holds up, but zoom out and look at all of them on the same timeline, and a pattern emerges that's harder to dismiss as coincidence. The Earth was restless in ways that don't fit neatly into the story of a calm, stable planet occasionally interrupted by isolated disasters. Now layer the photographic evidence on top of that geological record, because the cameras arrived just in time to catch something remarkable. From the 1850s through the 1880s, photographs from cities across the world show something that looks nothing like the stable, established urban centers. We're told these places were. Instead, the images show construction on a scale that's almost incomprehensible. Entire neighborhoods torn open, streets ripped up and rebuilt at higher elevations, ancient-looking buildings being demolished or buried under new fill. Workers everywhere, thousands of them in single photographs, digging, hauling, raising, covering. If you didn't know the official narrative, if you came to these images completely fresh, the most natural interpretation would be disaster recovery. It looks like cities rebuilding after a catastrophe, not cities modernizing during an era of peace and prosperity. The sheer simultaneity of it is what stands out. This wasn't happening in one city while others carried on as normal. It was happening everywhere, across multiple continents. In the same few decades, London, Paris, Moscow, New York, Boston, Chicago, all undergoing massive earthworks at roughly the same time, all raising their street levels, all burying older infrastructure beneath new construction. The conventional explanation frames all of this as progress, modernization, the natural evolution of growing cities, adapting to new technologies like gas lighting, sewage systems, and rail transport. And those factors were certainly real. Nobody disputes that the 19th century brought enormous technological change. But technological change doesn't require you to bury entire stories of existing buildings. It doesn't require raising every street in a city by 3 meters. It doesn't explain why the improvements look identical in cities separated by oceans and governed by completely different political systems. The pattern suggests something more fundamental than infrastructure upgrades. It suggests a response to a shared problem, a problem that affected the entire world at roughly the same time and demanded the same solution everywhere. Dig out, build up, cover over, move on. Travel journals and personal accounts from the early 1800s describe a world that sounds different from the one in our textbooks. Writers mention ruins everywhere, vast stretches of devastated landscape. Cities that were being rebuilt rather than built for the first time. Explorers describe encountering massive stone construction in places that supposedly had no advanced civilization. Buried structures emerging from hillsides, foundations with no buildings above them. These accounts have been reinterpreted over the decades to fit the accepted narrative when they mention rebuilding. Historians say they mean normal urban development when they describe buried ruins. We're told they're referring to Roman remains or medieval foundations. The words survive, but the meaning has been carefully managed. And managing meaning is a much subtler form of erasure than burning a library. You don't have to destroy the evidence if you can simply change what people think it means. Here's where the story becomes less about buried bridges and more about what those bridges represent. If even a fraction of these anomalies point to a genuine catastrophic event in the recent historical past, something that deposited meters of sediment across the globe, buried rivers, swallowed cities, and triggered decades of geological chaos, then the implications ripple outward in uncomfortable directions. The narrative of steady human progress, civilization slowly climbing from primitive to modern over millennia, starts to look less like established fact and more like a story we tell ourselves. Maybe the trajectory isn't a straight line upward. Maybe it's cyclical. Maybe what we call the Renaissance wasn't a rebirth of classical knowledge at all, but a desperate scramble to recover technology and understanding that had just been lost. Maybe we're not advancing, maybe we're recovering, slowly piecing together what a previous civilization already knew before something wiped the slate nearly clean. That idea is unsettling for reasons that go beyond academic curiosity. If advanced civilizations can be buried and forgotten within a few generations, then permanence is an illusion. Everything we've built, every skyscraper, every highway, every undersea cable could vanish beneath sediment and be dismissed as myth by whatever comes after us. It happened before. Some researchers argue, pointing to those buried bridges as proof. It could happen again. And maybe that's exactly why this line of inquiry meets such resistance from institutional gatekeepers. Not because the evidence is weak, but because the conclusion is terrifying. A world that has already experienced a reset is a world that could experience another one. That's not a comfortable thought for anyone invested in the idea that tomorrow will look roughly like today. The photographs are still sitting in archives, available to anyone willing to look. The buried foundations are still down there beneath modern streets. Measurable, photographable, real. The anomalies in the mortar and the metallurgy and the mathematics of those impossible arches haven't gone anywhere. The bridges remain partially hidden, stubbornly present, older and grander than the stories we've wrapped around them. They don't argue, they don't theorize, they just stand there in the dark, holding up roads and carrying traffic, keeping their secrets the way stone always does, patiently, silently, and for far longer than anyone is comfortable acknowledging. Whether the answers lie in catastrophic geology, in lost civilizations, or in some explanation nobody has proposed yet, one thing seems clear. The official story, as it stands, doesn't account for what's underground, and the bridges know it. They've been waiting, quietly, for someone to finally ask the right questions.